Okay, that's vision. And what Jesus is saying is that every longing that you have or think you have, every ache in your heart when you desire more stuff or more success or more security or more health or more attractiveness or more applause or more pleasure, what your soul is really crying out for is the kingdom of God to break through all the junk and all the sin and transform you into the person God had in mind when He created you. And the only thing that will satisfy your soul is for that to happen, for up there to come down here in my life and body, in your life and body. And that's the vision that's required. I'll say a little bit more about this idea of vision. That was sometimes use a little example about the role of vision, intention, and method in transformation, because all three of these are needed, but they all play a unique role. Let's think for a moment about kind of a different area of transformation, about learning a new language. Think about folks in China that are learning another language, most often English, or people in America that are learning a second language. Where are more folks trying to learn a new language, China or the U.S.? China by far. Think about methods. Rosetta Stone, tapes, seminars, books, classes, seminars. Where can you find more readily available methods for learning another language, China or the U.S.? The U.S. by far. Methods are way more available here for learning another language, and yet more people are learning it by far in China than are here. What's the difference? They have a vision in China for how their life will be changed if they learn another language. Most often it's English. And that vocational doors and educational doors and financial doors, opportunity doors will be open to them. And so that vision burns real hot. And when the vision is hot enough, people will search and search and search and do all kinds of stuff to try to find methods. Okay? When the vision is strong enough, it's not so much that you have a vision, it's that the vision has you. And you just got to have that. And when Jesus comes along, His life, just His person, and then His information about God and life is so superior to every other alternative that people could see that their response so often was, I would be a fool not to do whatever it takes to be His student. The next step is to form an intention. I don't need to say too much about intention, but I'll say a little bit. An intention is not a wish, and it's not a preference. It is a settled decision or commitment. And this is kind of an obvious thing, but we can overlook it. The only person who can actually form an intention for you is you. And we'll sometimes say things like, I wonder if it will rain, or I wonder if the Cubs will win a pennant. By the way, it's been 106 years since the Cubs won the pennant. Imagine saying, I wonder if I will learn Spanish. I wonder if some morning I'll wake up and I'll just be able to start speaking Spanish. When you decide, you make a commitment that it will be so. When you form an intention, you make a commitment. There's just an internal switch. This does involve the will, that you will pursue whatever means are necessary to make something happen. And so intention plays a very important role. We saw that in Jesus' day. But then where I want to spend a fair amount more time is around method or means. So there's vision, and there's intention, and there's means or method to pursuing transformation in the kingdom. The most helpful distinction that I heard Dallas make a long time ago when it comes to how do I actually pursue spiritual transformation in a way that's not legalistic but actually can be helpful is a distinction that goes way back to the New Testament and even earlier than that. And it is this: there is an enormous difference between trying to do something versus training to do something. And one of the places that talks about this is 1 Corinthians 9:24 and following. Paul says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it," that is, they go into strict training, "to get a crown that will not last. But we do it." We what? We go into strict training to win a crown that will last forever. "Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body, make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified from the prize." So there's this tremendous difference between training to do something versus trying to do something. Let's just think about physical transformation for a moment. I'll put this in the form of a question. How many of you would be able to go out of here right now this afternoon, and run, not walk, but run, every step of a marathon? Raise your hands, would you? Not a single marathon runner here? Wow. Oh, one. Okay. Second question. How many of you would be able to go out right now and run, not walk, every step of a marathon if you were to try really, 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 really hard? Okay, not many more. My guess is almost everybody here probably, if you really wanted to, eventually you would be able to run a marathon. What would you have to do first? You would have to train. What does it mean to train? Again, this is all from Dallas. To train means I arrange my life around those activities through which I receive power to do what I cannot now do by direct effort. Want that again? To train means I arrange my life around those activities through which I receive power to do that which I cannot now do by direct effort. One more time. To train means I arrange my life around those practices that enable me to do what I cannot now do by direct effort. And as a general rule in human life, we tremendously overestimate how much we can do by trying, and we tremendously underestimate what can be done by training. In almost any significant sphere of human activity, transformation involves training, not just trying. This is true of running a marathon. It's true of learning a language. It's true of playing a keyboard. Aren't you amazed at the way Gordon is able to play that keyboard? And people might think sometimes, I think, because we were asking him, didn't he say he started playing the keyboard when he was 3? 3 years old. People will think, to practice scales from the time you're 3 years old, for decades is the really hard way to be able to sit in front of a crowd and play a real complex Bach piece. To practice for decades is not the hard way to play Bach. It's the easy way. You want to know what the hard way is? Never ever practice a scale. Wait until the crowd assembles. Get behind a keyboard and try really, really, really hard. That's the hard way of doing it. Transformation generally involves training, not just trying. And this is true of our physical lives, and it's true of intellectual achievements, and it's true of music, and it is no less true when it comes to spiritual life. Paul says to Timothy, train yourself unto godliness, 1 Timothy 4:7. Or Jesus says in Luke 6:4, I think it is, no disciple is above the master, but every disciple, when fully trained, will be like the master. I don't think that's the right reference. Anybody remember what that is? 6:40? Thank you, 6:40. Luke 6:40. This gets us into the whole business of spiritual disciplines, which are closely related to that word, disciple. And this is always a little bit sticky. Whenever I talk about this with my wife, I have to be super careful because she hates the word training and she hates the word discipline. And of course, discipline sounds awful and unpleasant. And so a couple things about spiritual disciplines, about what spiritual disciplines are not. Spiritual disciplines are not things I do to earn brownie points with God. Spiritual disciplines are not a measure of how spiritual I am. And this is where legalism gets people into huge problems. We'll tend to think that spiritual disciplines or devotional practices are the means by which we measure how spiritual someone is. And the problem with that one, of course, is if you went back to Jesus' day and you said, like, whose devotional practices are the most intense, who would it be? Be the Pharisees. You know, we got to find a way to measure spiritual maturity such that the Pharisees don't win. Otherwise, we'll just produce more Pharisees. And a lot of times that's what we do. We end up measuring spiritual maturity in terms of devotional practices. But that's not the vision. The vision is never to be somebody who does a lot of spiritual practices. The vision is to be a person of love and joy. And spiritual disciplines are a means to an end. But the end is life. Spiritual disciplines are a means to an end. John Wesley used to call them conduits of grace. Through them, grace gets poured into us to enable us to do what we're not right now able to do by direct effort. And they are not necessarily unpleasant. What counts as a discipline depends on what it is that you're trying to train for. So, if you're trying to train for a marathon, what will you probably do a lot of? Probably do a lot of running. If your goal is to win a hot dog eating contest, anybody notice they have like a national hot dog eating contest once a year? If your vision is to win a hot dog eating contest, what should you do to train? Eat as many hot dogs every day as you can for the next year, and a year from now, you'll be able to eat more hot dogs than you can today by direct effort. Okay? What counts as training or discipline depends partly on what it is that you're trying to train for. And probably if what I'm trying to train for is a life of love and joy, some of the practices, disciplines, if you want to call them that, will not necessarily be unpleasant. Richard Foster, the last chapter that he wrote in his book, The Celebration of Discipline, is about the discipline of celebration. Okay, so, for example, in the Bible, we're commanded to be joyful. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Now, here's the thing, and this is what kills folks in our church. Come back to for anybody who teaches. So often, we give messages on Jesus or the Christian life, and what people take away is, I got to try harder to be like Jesus. And it does no more good than trying harder to run a marathon. Okay? Trying hard to be joylessness is a real serious problem in the church. It's a serious sin. And it's a great evangelistic barrier. But the solution is not to tell people to try harder to be joyful. And we'll get into this more. This has to do with habits and what the will can do and what the will cannot do. But to be a disciple of Jesus means, with a vision of a life of joy, I have come that my joy might be in you and your joy might be complete. Now that's a vision statement, but then what do I do with that? It's not that I try harder to be joyful, and it's not that I do nothing. Some people get paralyzed by the damage that legalism does, and they think, well, then I'm just supposed to do nothing and God will just pour stuff into me. Now, there actually is a role for me to play, but it's not earning and it's not legalism. I go into training for joy. I arrange my life around those activities through which I receive the power to do what I cannot now do by direct effort. Go through the Old Testament and you find there's all these days, scores and scores of them, where Israel would come together for feast days, and they would be together and enjoy each other and eat food that was wonderful food and sing music and dance. Why were they doing that? Those were training events for joy. They were training for joy. Nehemiah says to people, that wonderful passage in Nehemiah, I think it's 6:8, for the joy of the Lord is our strength. And it may be, if you wrestle with a lack of joy in your life, what you need is to take one day a week to be your celebration day, and wear clothes you love to wear, and eat food you love to eat, and listen to music you love to listen to, and be around people that fill you up with joy, because there'll be other people in your life that don't fill you with joy. They suck it out of you. They're like great black holes of joy, and you need to say to them that I can't be with you today. It's my joy day. I'll see you tomorrow. Yeah? So, vision of my life with God. And then an intention, I will have this. I will be a disciple. Dallas's definition of a disciple. A lot of times, it's so interesting, you know, the words Christian and disciple. And again, in our day, Christian tends to be kind of a vague term. It often just means, I don't belong to any other religion. You know, I'm not Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish or Muslim, but I believe in God, so I must be a Christian. Or people often assume it's, I got the heaven job done. You know, I know that I'm going to heaven when I die, so I'm in the Christian category, as opposed to the non-Christians who will go to the bad place when they die. And then, like, disciple, what is that? What's its connection to going to heaven when you die and so? Okay? Again, the gospel is not the announcement of the minimal entrance requirements for getting into heaven when you die. Who's going to heaven? I'm quite certain God will allow everyone into heaven that can possibly stand it. The gospel is that the kingdom is available right now. And if you get the vision of it, you're going to want it more than you've ever wanted anything else, because it's the thing that is supremely worth having. And then you will decide, I must have this. Whatever it takes, I will have it. And that's a disciple. A disciple is anybody whose ultimate goal is to live as Jesus would live in their place. A disciple is somebody whose ultimate goal is to live the way Jesus would live if he were in their place. What's a non-disciple? Non-disciple is somebody whose ultimate goal is anything else. Just that simple. And then, a part of how transformation happens that I pursue is through wise means or methods. And one of the simplest ways that I know of to kind of lay this out, to help us be intentional around it, is it will involve certain relationships, and certain experiences, and certain practices. And again, another word for practices is disciplines. I tend not to use that a lot just because the connotations that it has for so many people is negative and drudgery and that sort of thing. But certain practices, certain experiences. In the Bible, or actually if you talk with people, when you do surveys to people about when did you grow spiritually, number one answer people tend to give is suffering, times of suffering. And so if you're at a church, one of the things you want to do is assign suffering to the people in your congregation on a regular basis if they're not having it enough. Just the direct movement of the Holy Spirit in my life. And, you know, there's such powerful community in this, and I have folks that I'm very close to, very dear in my life, who are immersed in 12-step communities. And I remember, and I'll go to those meetings periodically, and one of the statements that killed me was somebody said, you can go to church and hear about miracles, or you can come here and see them. God, make the church the place where we can see him. So, experiences, relationships, And then I'll say a little bit more about the notion of practices or disciplines and when they can be helpful. And I know some of you are actually doing lots of really cool work on this stuff. There's different ways to slice practices up. One of them that Dallas uses is that there are practices of engagement when you do stuff that you wouldn't normally do, and then practices of abstinence where you refrain from doing things that you would normally do. Okay, so disciplines of engagement where I am doing stuff like study, worship, fellowship, giving, and then disciplines of abstinence like silence, fasting, solitude, where I'm refraining from stuff that I would normally do. Now, one question is, since disciplines are a means to an end, another way of really important thing to understand about disciplines is that the goal of discipline is always freedom. The goal of discipline, it is never a spiritual merit badge. And that's where, again, when churches start measuring spiritual maturity in terms of how many people are reading the Bible, how many minutes, and how many people are in small groups, it's not necessarily that those are bad things to measure. It's just real important to remember the Pharisee would do great with that. It can't be the ultimate measure. And the purpose of spiritual disciplines is always freedom. Dallas would say the mark of a disciplined person is not somebody who does a lot of disciplines. The mark of a disciplined person or a disciple is someone who's able to do what needs to be done when it needs doing. Mark of a disciplined person is someone who's able to do the right thing at the right time in the right way. And so, like in basketball, if the game is on the line and you get fouled, you got to be able to shoot a free throw. Now, in order to do that, probably you need to practice a whole bunch of free throws. But if you can make it in the game without practicing, don't bother practicing. You don't get extra credit for practicing a lot. The point is to be able to do the right thing in the moment. Okay, God is not interested in some weird little thing called your spiritual life. He's just interested in your life. Just the whole thing. And that it be a life of love and joy. That's the vision. Okay? And so spiritual disciplines are practices, means through which I gain the freedom to do what needs to be done in the right moment. So a disciplined keyboard person is able to make fabulous music when that's needed. And that's built on all kinds of disciplines, but, you know, that hopefully is not drudgery. And it's all about the freedom to be able to do what needs to be done in the moment. And I want to be able to do that with my mouth and with my body, with my words and my actions and so on. So there are certain practices of engagement and certain practices of abstinence. And what happens when we're involved in these spiritual disciplines is they disrupt the habitual patterns in our minds and bodies and make space for God. Okay? Disciplines like these disrupt habitual patterns in my mind and body and make space for God. And it can be helpful to think about, depending on what's blocking me from living that kind of life that I want to, what disciplines might be particularly helpful. And a lot of times, intuitively, we kind of have a sense of this. Somebody was asking a while ago about gossip. And we've talked about gossip a couple of times. How do you not gossip? Well, probably won't happen by trying really hard not to gossip. But there actually is a way to grow in the ability to not gossip, and that is to train to not gossip. Can anybody think of any particular spiritual practices that might be helpful in training your body to not gossip? Silence. Sorry, what was the other one? Duct tape. Yeah. Well, that's like silence on steroids. Yeah. So, and this kind of gets a little bit into looking at what disciplines might be helpful for life. There's also kind of two categories traditionally that we have put sin in. every sin is either a sin of omission or a sin of commission. Now, a sin of commission is when I do something I shouldn't do. Like gossip. In gossip, I'm doing something I shouldn't do. I'm saying what I shouldn't say. Very often, that will be helped by a discipline of abstinence. Because abstinence involves not doing something. So it's strengthening my not doing muscles. And that will help me if I need to not do stuff, like gossip. On the other hand, there are sins of omission, like joylessness, where I'm not doing something, and very often there, disciplines or practices of engagement, like the practice of celebration, then I'm doing something that can strengthen my not do omission sins. It's always a little bit tricky to teach out, but does that make sense for folks? So sins of omission, that's where I don't do what I should, so then doing stuff will probably help me. And sins of commission, that's where I do what I shouldn't do, and so practicing not doing can help me. And to help folks in our churches, and for you and I to experiment with, again, the goal with spiritual disciplines is not to master the disciplines. That's not it at all. The goal is just life. Okay, spiritual practices or disciplines are terribly important, but they're not the things by which we feel good or bad about our spiritual life. They are a means to an end, and that end is just life. I remember asking Dallas about that one time, because I grew up in a context where somebody said, "How's your spiritual life going?" Which, by the way, is a great way to kill conversation if you're at a party. Just go up to people, "Hey, how's your spiritual life going?" And but if somebody asked me about that, I'd always immediately think, how my quiet time's going? And all of a sudden I realized that's the wrong thing to think about, because Pharisees would say, great, but they're really doing bad. So what should I think? So I asked Dallas, somebody asked you, how's your spiritual life going? What do you think about? His immediate response was, I asked myself, am I getting more or less easily irritated these days? And am I growing more or less easily discouraged these days? Because I find if I'm living in the love of God, I just get harder to irritate. And if the peace of Christ is reigning in my mind, when opposition comes, I'm less easily discouraged. And I had never thought about gauging my spiritual well-being in those categories. And that may help you, or you may want to think about others. But of course, what you'll notice immediately is both of those questions get to the vision of life with God. And that's a life of love beyond chronic irritation. And a life of presence beyond chronic discouragement. So, that's the little framework for transformation. Always involves vision. This always gets distorted, needs to be kept fresh. It's a vision, not just a theology of God, but a very personal vision of my life with God. And then an intention. I must have this. I decide I'll do what it takes. And then methods. It involves a life of training, not just trying. Relationships, practices, experiences. We ought to be very experimental with all of that. You have a different temperament. You have different sins that you wrestle with. You're at a different season of life. It'll look different for you than for you than for you. We learn about that all together. It's not legalistic at all, but it is not passive at all. It's very active. We're engaged fully. But in all of it, we're just seeking to receive power and grace from God for His kind of life. And it is not what we're doing. It's how we respond to the power of God at work in us. And we've got a couple minutes left, so I'll stop at that point.